The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Annie Brooks decided she had nothing left to lose. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in Mrs. Calloway's boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, the year being 1874, and she pressed the folded paper flat against her knee with both palms, as if she could iron out every crease that had been put into it during the 3-day journey from her cousin Martha's place in Missouri. The room smelled of tallow candles and the faint sweetness of dried lavender that Mrs. Calloway tucked behind every door frame, and outside the single window the main street of Abilene buzzed and clattered with the ordinary noise of a cattle town in autumn. A wagon creaked past. Someone laughed too loud. A horse objected to something with a short, irritated snort. Annie heard none of it particularly. She was reading the advertisement for the 4th time, and each time she read it she felt the same complicated thing in her chest, which was neither hope nor hopelessness but sat squarely between the two in a territory she had no name for yet. The advertisement had been placed in the Kansas City paper by a man named Eli Boone, rancher, of Harlan Creek, Texas. It was composed in plain, careful language, the kind of language that told you more about a person than any amount of flowery words ever could. He stated his age as 28. He described his land as 340 acres, good grass, reliable creek, a house that was finished but not fancy. He wrote that he was looking for a woman of good character and steady temperament who was not afraid of hard work and who would be willing to come to Texas and be married. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he was not a man given to cruelty, and that he did not drink to excess, and that whoever came would be treated fairly in all respects. He did not promise love. He did not promise happiness. He promised fairness, and Annie, who had known enough men who promised beautiful things and delivered nothing at all, found that honesty startling and somehow more attractive than any sonnet could have been. She had written back 3 weeks ago, and she had chosen her own words with the same kind of deliberate plainness. She wrote that she was 24 years old. She wrote that she had been a schoolteacher in Abilene for 2 years, and before that had helped her father run a small dry goods store in Missouri until he died of fever in the winter of 1871, and left her with debts she spent the following year settling. She wrote that she had no family to speak of beyond a cousin who had her own struggles and her own mouths to feed. She wrote that she could cook, keep a house, manage accounts, and that she had a strong constitution and was not given to complaint. And then she wrote the line that she had not planned to write, the line that came out of her pen before she could think better of it. She wrote that she expected nothing beyond what he had already offered, which was fairness, and that she would bring the same in return. She expected nothing. She sealed the letter and sent it before she could change her mind, and now, 3 weeks later, there was his reply sitting in her hands, and it was 4 sentences long. Miss Brooks, I received your letter and I would be grateful if you would come. I will send the stage fare by next post. The house is ready. My name is Eli, and you are welcome here. Annie folded the letter back along its creases and held it in her lap for a long time after that. She was a practical woman. She had learned to be practical the way most women in this country learned, which was by necessity, by loss, by the slow grinding away of every soft thing until what remained was a core of quiet determination. She did not cry easily, and she did not make decisions lightly, and she did not believe in fairy stories. But something about those 4 sentences, about the plainness of them, about the word welcome sitting at the end like a small lantern in a very dark road, made her press her lips together very tightly and breathe through her nose in a way that meant she was feeling something she had not expected to feel. She began to pack that afternoon. The stage to Harlan Creek took 4 days, with a full overnight stop in a crowded way station outside of Wichita, and another in a settlement whose name Annie never caught because she was asleep against the wooden side of the coach when they passed through. She shared the journey with a traveling merchant who smelled of pipe tobacco and talked too much about cattle prices, a young mother with a baby who woke every 2 hours through the night, and an older woman in good black wool who never spoke at all but watched everything with sharp, intelligent eyes. Annie watched the landscape change. She watched Kansas become the edge of something wilder, grassland stretching so far in every direction that the sky felt enormous and a little threatening. And then gradually the Texas scrubland took over, pale gold and dusty red, thorny and stubborn and beautiful in a way that required some patience to appreciate. She arrived in the town of Harlan Creek on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of October, 1874. The town was smaller than Abilene, which she had expected, but it had everything a town needed. A general store, a livery, a blacksmith, a small church with white paint that was beginning to peel at the corners, a saloon that was doing business even at 2 in the afternoon, a post office that also served as a barber, and a single main street that turned to dust as soon as you stepped off the plank sidewalk. The stage stopped in front of the post office, and the driver climbed down and handed her bag to her and tipped his hat, and that was the entirety of the ceremony of her arrival. She stood on the plank sidewalk with her bag at her feet and her back straight and her hat pinned correctly, and she looked up and down the street and thought, well, here I am. She did not have to look long. He was already there. She knew him not because she had any description of him, because his advertisement had contained none, but because he was standing 10 feet away with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that she could only describe as careful, the way a person looks when they are trying very hard to give nothing away while feeling quite a lot. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had imagined, with dark hair that was a little too long at the collar, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hard country he lived in. His eyes were the brown of creek water after rain, and they found hers immediately, and he did not look away. He said, "Miss Brooks," she said, "Mr. Boone." There was a pause in which Harlan Creek went about its afternoon business all around them, indifferent to the enormity of the moment. He stepped forward and picked up her bag before she could reach for it, and he said, "The wagon is just down the way. I hope the journey wasn't too hard," she said. "It was fine." He nodded, and they walked side by side to the wagon, and she climbed up to the seat with the easy practice of someone who had done it 100 times, and he tied her bag in the back and then climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Harlan Creek into the scrubland going west, and neither of them said anything for almost a full mile. Then he said, without looking at her, "I want you to know that I mean what I wrote. You're welcome here. There's no performance required." Annie turned her head and looked at his profile. He was watching the road with that same careful expression. She said, "What do you mean by performance?" He said, "I mean you don't have to pretend to like it straight away if you don't. You don't have to pretend anything. I'd rather know the truth of things." She looked at him a moment longer. She said, "I appreciate that." He nodded once, and she turned back to the road, and the wagon rolled on through the late afternoon light, which had turned everything gold and rose and the particular color of honey held up to a window. The house was better than not fancy. It was a solid adobe and timber structure, 1 story, with a covered porch that ran the full front width, and a kitchen garden to the side that still had some late squash and dried bean stalks in it, and a barn that was in better repair than the house. There was a cottonwood tree by the well that was turning yellow, and when the evening wind came through it, the leaves shook and whispered, and the sound of it was one of the most peaceful things Annie had ever heard. He showed her through the house. It was clean. Genuinely clean, not the approximate cleanliness of a man who had swept in a panic the day before, but the kind of deep, maintained cleanliness that told you something about his character. The kitchen had a good iron stove and a solid table and 2 chairs. The main room had a fireplace and a braided rug and a bookshelf with perhaps 20 books, which surprised her. The bedroom at the back was for her alone. He had made up the cot in the small room off the kitchen for himself, and he stated this without embarrassment, simply as a fact, and she was grateful for it and told him so. She said, "The books are yours," he said, "most of them. Some were my mother's." She walked to the shelf and let her finger move along the spines. There was a Bible, of course, and a farming almanac, and then some things she had not expected. A collection of poetry by Tennyson, a history of the Roman Republic, 2 novels she recognized and one she didn't. She pulled out the one she didn't recognize. He said from where he was standing by the door, "It's a novel out of England. My mother ordered it through the catalog years ago. I've read it twice." She put it back carefully. She turned and looked at him. She said, "You read?" He said, "Is that surprising?" She said, "A little. Most men who place advertisements in papers don't mention books." Something shifted in his expression then, something that was almost but not quite a smile. He said, "Most men who place advertisements in papers don't mention a great many things." They ate supper together that first evening, beans and cornbread that he had made himself, and coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she ate all of it because she was genuinely hungry and because it was good. He asked her about Missouri and about teaching school, and she answered him honestly and asked him about the ranch, about how long he had worked this land, about where he had come from before. He told her he had come from Tennessee originally, that his parents had moved west when he was 11, that his father had died of a snake bite when Eli was 19 and his mother had gone back east to live with her sister 2 years after that, and that he had worked the ranch alone since he was 21. She said, 7 years alone. He said, there were hands some of those years, not always. She said, that's a long time to work land alone. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, it is. There was something in the way he said it that she did not press, but she heard it, the weight of it, the 7 years of solitude sitting in those 2 quiet words, and she filed it away in the careful, organized place in her mind where she kept the things that mattered. They married the following Saturday. The ceremony was performed by Pastor Reeves at the little white church in Harlan Creek, and it lasted 20 minutes, and the witnesses were a neighboring rancher named Cal Dawson and his wife Bess, who was friendly and warm and who shook Annie's hand afterward with both of her own and said, "I'm so glad he finally did something about that empty house," in a tone that made it clear she had been waiting for this development with considerable impatience. The ring was a simple gold band. He placed it on her finger with steady hands, and his eyes met hers during the words of the ceremony with an expression so solemn and earnest that she felt something pull at the underside of her sternum in a way that was new and a little frightening. They drove back to the ranch in the evening light, and she was his wife, and the cottonwood tree was still turning its yellow leaves in the wind, and the house was still clean and solid, and none of it was a fairy story, but it was real. And she was learning that real things, when you paid attention, could take your breath away just as cleanly. The first week settled into a rhythm. She took over the kitchen, which she did not do because she believed it was her obligated duty, but because she genuinely preferred to have a domain she understood while she was still learning the larger terrain. She learned the ranch gradually, going out in the mornings to watch him work, asking questions that he always answered directly and without condescension, which she appreciated more than she said. He had 140 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and 2 ranch hands who came by day and went home to the bunkhouse at the neighboring Dawson spread in the evenings. Their names were Pete, who was 50-something and who had worked cattle his entire life and who had a dry, economical sense of humor, and Clem, who was 20 and serious about everything, and who regarded Annie with a kind of cautious respect that she found endearing. She planted more in the kitchen garden. She repaired the curtains in the main room, which were faded and pulling free from their rings. She organized the pantry. She found that the accounting for the ranch had been kept in a haphazard fashion, not dishonestly, but with the casualness of a man who understood cattle and land, and whether better than ledger books, and she gently took over that work too, and the first time she showed Eli the corrected accounts he sat across the kitchen table from her and studied them for a long time. He looked up and said, "You can see the difference in the spring margins here. I didn't know I was paying that rate for the feed shipments." She said 2 of the invoices from Henderson's Supply had errors in them. I don't know if they were deliberate. I would check the previous years as well. He looked at her steadily. He said, "Did you do all this last night?" She said, "Some of it. I finished this morning." He said, "Annie." It was the first time he had used her given name just like that, without the formality of Miss. It sat in the air between them like something warm. He said, "Thank you, this matters." She said, "It is simply accounting." He said, "No, it is considerably more than that." She looked down at the ledger and did not answer, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the wind against the window. November came in cold and fast. The first hard frost arrived in the second week, and Eli spent 3 days with Pete and Clem moving the cattle closer in. And Annie watched from the porch in the early morning in her heaviest shawl and saw the way he worked. The patience of it, the easy competence, the way the horses responded to him, the way he spoke to the cattle, not in the nonsense soothing way some men did, but in a low, practical murmur that still managed to have a kind of gentleness in it. She noticed things about him the way you only notice things when you are paying real attention. That he was never cruel to any living creature. That he read every evening by the firelight, sometimes aloud if she was nearby, which she gradually came to be more often. That he had a habit of pausing in the middle of tasks and looking at the sky for a moment, just a moment, as if checking in with something. That he laughed rarely, but when he did it was genuine, and it changed his whole face and made her want to make him do it again. She did not say any of this to him. She was not sure yet what the language of this arrangement was supposed to be. She had come here expecting fairness, and she had found it in generous measure, and she was grateful, but she had not come expecting warmth. And she was finding that too, in increments, in the way he always made sure her coffee was ready before his own, in the way he held the door, in the way he had asked her one evening what she was thinking, and had actually listened to the full answer. Which was a thing so few people had ever done that it caught her off guard, and she had to stop speaking for a moment before she could continue. Bess Dawson came to visit in the middle of November and stayed for the afternoon, and she and Annie sat in the kitchen with coffee and dried apple cake, and talked with the ease of women who have recognized in each other a similar quality of directness. Bess had been in the territory for 12 years, and she knew everyone and everything, and she told Annie the full history of Harlan Creek with efficient pleasure, who had come and gone, who was difficult and who was good, and where to get the best flour and who to avoid when you needed a fair price on anything. At some point Bess said, not quite casually, "He's a good man, Eli is. Genuinely. I've known him 9 years, and I have never seen him be unkind to anyone, not once. Cal says he's the most patient man in the county with animals and the second most patient with people." Annie said, "And who is the most patient with people?" Bess laughed. She said, "Me, apparently. Cal is very impressed with himself for saying that." Annie smiled. She said, "He does seem to be a good man." Bess looked at her, not unkindly, with those sharp, experienced eyes. She said, "He was lonely, you know. Before, not in a way he would ever say, but you could see it. He'd come to supper with us, and you could see it in him. That particular kind of quiet that isn't peaceable, that's just empty." Annie thought of the 7 years alone. She looked at her coffee cup. Bess said, "I think he's different already. I noticed it when you both came into town last week for supplies. He walks differently." Annie said, "Differently how?" Bess said, "Like he's not just moving from one task to the next anymore. Like there's somewhere he actually wants to come back to." Annie did not know what to do with this, so she changed the subject to the price of fabric at the general store, and Bess, who was wise enough to recognize when something needed to be left alone to grow, let her. The weather turned in December, and they were snowed in for 4 days, which was unusual enough for that part of Texas that Pete and Clem went home to ride it out, and Eli and Annie were alone in the house with the fire and the books and the wind that drove against the walls and the food she had put up through the autumn. On the first evening of the snow, he built the fire up high, and she made soup from the dried beef and the last of the potato store, and they sat at the table together and ate in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the previous weeks, a silence that was not empty but full, that held both of them without pressure. Later, in the main room, she took the Tennyson from the shelf and sat in the chair by the fire and opened it, and he looked up from the almanac he was studying and said, "Would you read aloud? I don't often have the chance to hear it read aloud." She said, "What would you like?" He said, "Anything you like." She found a passage almost at random and began to read, and the fire cracked and the snow came against the window, and her voice moved through the room. And she was halfway through the second poem before she noticed that he had set the almanac entirely aside and was simply watching her, not the book, her, with an expression that she had no name for, but that made her stumble slightly over a word and then recover. She finished reading and looked up, and he quickly looked down at the almanac, and she said nothing, but she felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. On the second day of the snow, he asked her, after a morning in which they had fed the cattle together and come inside red-faced and half-frozen, whether she had been happy in her life before this. It was an unexpected question, and she thought about it seriously before she answered. She said, "I was content. I am not sure I was happy. Happy seems to require something in you that I spent some time not having. I was good at my work and I was self-sufficient and I was not miserable." But there was a kind of flatness to it. He was warming his hands at the stove, and he did not look at her when he said, "What was missing?" She said, "Someone to read aloud to, perhaps." There was a pause, and then he laughed, that rare, genuine laugh, and she felt the triumph of it like something she wanted to keep. He said, "And now," she said carefully, "the flatness is less." He turned and looked at her then, and the look lasted only a moment, but it was the kind of moment that changes the quality of a whole day, that you carry with you and examine later in the dark before sleep. He turned back to the stove and said, "I'm glad." On the third day of the snow, she found him in the barn in the late afternoon, working on a piece of harness by lamplight, and she brought him coffee without being asked, and he looked at her when she held it out to him, and something in his face opened, just briefly, like a room you have walked past 100 times, and one day the door is simply standing open. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know I didn't have to." He took the coffee and she stayed, leaning against the barn post, and they talked for an hour in the lamplight while the snow came down outside, about everything and nothing, about Tennessee and Missouri, about what they had each wanted as children and what they had been given instead, about the particular beauty of the cottonwood tree, and about whether the spring would come early or late. And somewhere in the middle of all that talking, Annie became aware that she was very warm, and that it was not the barn that was doing it. On the fourth day the snow stopped and the afternoon sun came out and turned the world white and brilliant, and Eli went out to check on the cattle and Annie went with him, and they walked together through the glittering silence of the pasture, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. She stepped in a drift that was deeper than it looked and went in up to her knee, and she made a sound of surprise, and he was beside her in the next instant, his hand at her elbow, steadying her, pulling her free, and she was out of the drift and standing on solid ground, and his hand was still at her elbow, and they were standing very close together. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The winter sun was behind him, and his eyes were warm and dark and entirely serious. He said quietly, "You all right?" She said, "Yes, yes." He did not immediately remove his hand from her elbow. She did not step back. The moment stretched, breathed, existed. Then the nearest cow chose that instant to let out a considerable complaint about the snow, and they both moved apart, and she laughed and he looked relieved and rueful at the same time, and they went on through the pasture, and she thought about his hand on her elbow for the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening, and she suspected, from the way he was very careful to look at his book rather than at her after supper, that he was thinking about it too. Christmas came and she made the best meal the pantry could support, roasted a chicken and made biscuits and a dried peach pudding, and he came in from the barn on Christmas morning with a package wrapped in brown paper, and he set it on the table in front of her with the careful manner of someone who was not sure how a gift would be received. She opened it. Inside was a leather journal, good quality, with her initials stamped on the cover. She recognized that it must have required him to go to some effort to obtain it, because the general store in Harlan Creek did not carry things of this quality. She said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "I wrote to a bookseller in San Antonio back in November. It came last week with the post." She held the journal in both hands and looked at the initials AB, which were now her initials in the new sense as well as the old, and she felt something press up behind her eyes that she would not permit to be tears. She said, "Eli," he said, "you were going through the backs of the ledger pages writing notes to yourself. I thought you might like somewhere better to put your thoughts." She said, "I had noticed you doing the same in your almanac margins." He said, "I ordered myself a journal too. It seemed only fair." She looked up at him. He was watching her with those careful brown eyes and that almost smile, and she made a decision that was at the same time a very large and a very small one. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, just for a moment, and she said, "Thank you, truly." He turned his hand under hers and held it briefly, his thumb moving once across her knuckles with a gentleness that was almost painful in its restraint. And then he released it and said something about checking on the horses, and she sat with the journal in her lap and her hand tingling for a long time after he went out. January was cold and demanding, and the days were long with work, but the evenings were theirs, and the evenings became the center of her days in a way she had not anticipated. They read and talked and sometimes played checkers at the kitchen table, and she won more often than he did, which delighted her and seemed, improbably, to delight him as well. He taught her how to shoot, which she had some basic knowledge of, but not the precision he had, and she proved to be a faster student than he expected, and he told her so with a degree of straightforward admiration that made her stand up straighter. She taught him the correct method of double entry accounting, which he claimed to find boring but which he practiced with a diligence that suggested he was taking it seriously. One evening in January he asked her if she missed teaching school. She considered this for a while. She said, "I miss the children, the learning, the moment when something becomes clear to a child who has been struggling with it. There is nothing quite like that." He said, "You could teach here. There are 14 children in the area that I know of whose families are too far out for the school in town." She said, "You're suggesting I open a school here," he said, "not a formal school. But perhaps 2 or 3 mornings a week if you wanted I could spread the word. I believe the families would be grateful." She looked at him across the checkerboard. She said, "You've been thinking about this." He said, "A little. You lit up when you talked about the children." She had not known he was watching her closely enough to notice when she lit up. She felt the back of her neck go warm. She said, "I would like that. Yes." By February, she had 7 children coming to the ranch house 3 mornings a week, ranging in age from 6 to 12, and she set up the main room as a classroom, and she was happier during those mornings than she had been in a long time. And Eli moved his morning work around to ensure that the noise from the barn would not disturb her, which she only realized he was doing after the 3rd week. And when she thanked him, he looked surprised, as if it had not occurred to him that it needed thanking. He said, "You shouldn't have to manage around me. This is your house too," she said. "You said that before, that it was my house too." He said, "Did I?" She said, "When I first arrived. You said you were welcome here, and then later that it was my house." He said, "I meant it both times." She said, "I know, that's why I remember." He looked at her for a long moment and then he turned back to what he had been doing, but she saw the color that touched the back of his neck, and she smiled to herself and went back to the kitchen. In February, 2 things happened that changed the course of things considerably. The first was that a man came to the ranch, a man Annie had never seen before, who arrived on a lathered horse on a Wednesday morning, and who spoke to Eli on the porch for 20 minutes while Annie watched from the window and knew, from the set of Eli's shoulders, that whatever was being said was not good news. The man rode away, and Eli came inside with the careful, controlled expression he used when something was serious. He said, "There's a claim dispute coming. A man named Hargrove out of Fort Worth is making an argument that the eastern quarter of my land, was never properly recorded in the county ledgers after the title change. My father bought this land from a man named Sellers in 1865, and Sellers kept poor records, and now Hargrove says he has a deed that predates my father's purchase. Annie said, "Does he?" Eli said, "I don't know. My father's paperwork is in the deed box. I haven't looked at it in years." She said, "Get the box." They spent that afternoon and the following morning going through every document in the deed box together. And Annie's accounting and organizational mind was precise and useful in this work. She found the original bill of sale from Sellers to Eli's father, dated June 1865, and she found the county registration notice, and she found the tax records going back 9 years that established continuous and legitimate possession, and she organized all of it in a sequence that told a clear, unambiguous story. She said, "This is solid. If Hargrove has a deed that predates this, it is forged, because Sellers did not own this land before 1862, and there is a record here of Sellers' own purchase that establishes that." Eli sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at the organized papers and then at her. He said, "How did you know to look for Sellers' chain of title?" She said, "My father dealt with a disputed account once. I learned then that to prove where you stand, you have to go back further than the problem." He said, "Annie." She looked up. He was looking at her with that open expression again, the room with the door standing open look, and it was stronger now, and she held very still because she was afraid to do anything that might close it. He said, "What did I do to deserve you coming here?" She said, very quietly, "You were honest. In a plain advertisement in a newspaper, you told the truth. That is rarer than you think." He reached across the table. He did not take her hand this time, but he put his hand down beside hers so that they were almost touching, and he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly." She said, "Then say it." He said, "I placed that advertisement because I needed help with the ranch, and I was lonely, and I was practical enough to admit it. I did not allow myself to expect anything beyond what I said. Someone steady, someone fair." He looked at the papers and then back at her. "What I have found is something I don't entirely have the language for, and I am aware that we have an arrangement that you entered into on particular terms, and I would not want to make you uncomfortable or ask for more than what was agreed." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the February wind moved through the cottonwood. She said, "Eli, I wrote in my letter that I expected nothing. I said that I would be fair and I expected fairness in return. That is what I wrote." He said, "I know." She said, "What I did not write, because I did not yet know it, is that fairness turns out to be the beginning of something and not the end of it." He went very still. She said, "I would not object to being asked for more, if that is what you were working toward." He let out a breath that she realized, hearing it, he had been holding for some time. He turned his hand over on the table and she put hers in it, and his fingers closed around hers with a care and a firmness that said everything his words had been trying to arrange themselves around. He said, "I have been falling in love with you since the evening you told me that reading aloud was perhaps what you had been missing. I thought it was the most honest and unexpected thing anyone had ever said to me." She said, "I think I have been falling in love with you since you answered my letter in 4 sentences, and the last word was welcome." He stood up from his chair and she stood up from hers, and they were on the same side of the table, and he put his hand against her face very carefully, as if she were something that could be startled away, and she put her hand over his and held it there, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back. And the winter light came through the kitchen window, and the deed papers sat in their orderly pile on the table, and none of it was a fairy story, but it was so entirely and completely real that she felt the realness of it all the way through, the warmth of it, the solidity of it, like good ground under feet that have been walking uncertain terrain for a very long time. The land dispute with Hargrove was settled in the county courthouse in March. Annie went with Eli, sitting beside him at the long table in the clerk's office, and she laid out the papers in their sequence and spoke clearly and without hesitation when the county clerk asked her to explain the chain of title. And the clerk studied the documents and Hargrove's attorney studied the documents. And after 2 hours of examination, the clerk declared that the Boone title was clear and properly recorded, and that Hargrove's deed was not supported by the historical record of ownership. Hargrove's attorney tried twice more to make an argument, and both times Annie produced a document from the organized file that addressed his point directly. And by the third attempt, the attorney looked at Hargrove and shrugged, and Hargrove stood up and left without a word, and the clerk stamped the Boone deed with an official confirmation of title. Outside the courthouse, standing on the wooden steps in the March wind, Eli looked at her with an expression that was so warm and so unguarded that she felt it like sunlight. He said, "You were extraordinary in there." She said, "I was organized. There is a difference." He said, "There is no difference in this case." He took her hand, right there on the courthouse steps in front of Harlan Creek's modest afternoon foot traffic, and she let him, and they walked to the wagon hand in hand. And Cal Dawson passed them on the street, and he tipped his hat and grinned in the way of a man who has been waiting for this particular development with great satisfaction. And Annie felt happiness, the real kind, the bone-deep kind, for the first time in years. Spring came to the ranch like a gift. The creek ran high and clear, and the pastures turned green, and the cattle calved. And there were 2 weeks in April where every morning was a new emergency of one kind or another, as calves arrived and needed attention, and the pasture fences needed checking after the winter, and the kitchen garden needed turning and planting. Annie worked alongside Eli through all of it, learning what she didn't know, contributing what she did, and there was a joy in the work that she had not anticipated, the physical satisfaction of it, the clean tiredness at the end of a full day, the way you slept deeply and woke ready. They were no longer careful around each other. The carefulness had been good and necessary in the beginning, but now it was gone, replaced with something easier, more natural, that still had all the tenderness but none of the tension. He touched her hair in the evenings when she sat near him. She put her hand on his arm when she wanted his attention. They argued twice, genuinely argued, once about the best route for a supply run, and once about whether the south pasture fence needed replacing this year or could wait, and both arguments were resolved by one of them producing a sufficiently good point that the other had to concede, and neither of them held the losing for longer than it took to be over. The children kept coming to the morning school, and Annie added 2 more, 9 children now, and Eli built a proper writing table for the main room and set it against the wall so that there was more room for the students, and he did it on a Saturday when she was in town with Bess, so that she came home to find it there, solid and well-made, and she stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at it and said his name in a tone that brought him immediately from the barn. He said, "Does it work? I can move it if the placement isn't right." She crossed the room in 4 steps and put her arms around him, which was something she had not done before, not with that kind of fullness, and his arms came around her and he held her with the same quality that he had in everything he did, steady and thorough and genuinely present. She said against his shoulder, "You keep doing this." He said, "Doing what?" She said, "Finding what I need before I know I need it." He said, "I pay attention." She pulled back enough to look at him. She said, "Yes, you do." He kissed her, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palm. And outside the spring wind moved through the cottonwood, and the creek ran high and brilliant in the afternoon light. In May, Bess Dawson sat across from Annie at her own kitchen table because they had been visiting back and forth regularly now for months, and she folded her hands around her coffee cup and said, with the particular directness of a woman who sees exactly what she is looking at, "You are different from when you arrived." Annie said, "Different how?" Bess said, "You arrived like a woman bracing for impact, perfectly capable, perfectly composed, but braced. Now you look like a woman who has stopped expecting to have to dodge something." Annie thought about the letter she had written. "I expect nothing beyond what you have already offered." She thought about how true that had been when she wrote it and about how completely it had been superseded by everything that came after. She said, "I wrote in my first letter to Eli that I expected nothing, just fairness. I meant it." Bess said, "I know. He told Cal about that letter. He said it was the most honest thing he had read in years, and that it made him both respect you and want to give you every single thing you hadn't asked for." Annie set down her coffee cup. Something closed her throat for just a moment. She said, "He said that," Bess said. "He did. Cal told me right after Eli got your reply, and Eli never knew Cal told me, and I was not going to say anything, but here we are." Annie looked at the window at the May light, at the ordinary miracle of a good day in Texas. She said, "He has done exactly that from the first day." Bess said, "Yes, I know. It is very good to see." In June, Annie discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted to be sure, and because she wanted to have the right words, and because it was enormous and she needed a little time to let it be enormous before she shared it. She told him on a June evening when the heat was soft and the sky was pink and they were sitting on the porch, which had become their evening habit, watching the light go out of the day. She said it plainly because plain was the language they had built their lives in, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he turned to her with an expression that was entirely undisguised, that had none of the careful control she had first seen on the Harlan Creek sidewalk, that was just joy, simple and complete. He said, "Annie," she said, "I know." He reached out and took her hand and held it in both of his, and he said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" She said, "I feel fine. A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise completely well." He said, "We'll need to get you to the doctor in town." She said, "I know, I thought perhaps next week." He said, "Tomorrow." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that fullness of feeling that still, after 8 months, could catch her off guard with its completeness. She said, "Tomorrow, then." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth, and the porch held them both in the evening quiet, and the cottonwood moved, and the creek could just be heard if you were listening, and she thought, "I wrote that I expected nothing. I had no idea what that nothing was going to become." They went to town the next day and saw Dr. Whitfield, who was a sensible, experienced man who had delivered half the children in the county and who confirmed what Annie already knew and told them both that she was in excellent health and that he expected no difficulties. On the way home in the wagon, Eli said, "What would you like to name a boy?" She said, "James, after my father." He said, "And a girl?" She said, "I haven't thought yet. What would you like?" He thought for a moment, watching the road. He said, "Clara. It was my mother's middle name." She said, "James and Clara, those are good names." He said, "We may not need both." She said, "Probably not for this one, but we could work our way through them eventually." He turned and looked at her, and his smile was so warm and open, and entirely his, that she felt it settle into the very center of her like something she had been missing the shape of without knowing it. The summer was long and good. Annie continued teaching through July, when the heat became remarkable and she cut the sessions shorter, and the children came reliably, and she was fond of all of them in different ways, particularly a 6-year-old girl named Lucy Hartwell, whose family had a spread 8 miles north, and who was the brightest and most obstinate child Annie had ever taught, and who reminded her pleasantly of herself. Lucy's mother, a woman named Dora Hartwell, had become a friend, another welcome thing, another unexpected thing, another thing Annie had not written into her letter of expectations. Eli added a room to the house in August. He and Pete and Clem worked on it for 3 weeks, and she could see through the main room window the frame going up, and then the walls, and then the roof. And she brought them all water at regular intervals. And Pete accepted it with a nod, and Clem accepted it with a flustered gratitude that was unchanged from the first day he had arrived, and Eli accepted it with a look that said everything without words. The new room was off the main bedroom, small but complete, and he put a proper floor in it and whitewashed the walls and built a cradle himself, which she found him working on in the barn on several evenings in August, bent over the wood with a careful attention that was the same attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. She stood in the doorway of the barn one evening and watched him sand the side of the cradle, and she thought about the man who had placed an honest advertisement in a Kansas City newspaper, and the woman who had answered it with equal honesty, and she thought about how neither of them had imagined this specific and particular happiness, and she thought that perhaps that was the nature of real things, that they exceeded the imagination of the people who stumbled into them. He looked up and saw her watching. He said, "Does it look all right?" She walked across the barn and put her hand on the cradle and rocked it gently on its runners. She said, "It's beautiful." He said, "I've never made a cradle before. I wasn't sure about the runners." She said, "The runners are perfect." He stood up and put his hand over hers on the cradle's side, and they rocked it together, and the lamp threw warm gold across the barn, and the night was full of cricket's song, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a while, quiet in the good warm dark. The baby came in January of 1876, which meant Annie had nearly a full year on the ranch before it happened, and she was settled enough in herself and in the house, and in the life to meet the event with the steady preparedness that Bess Dawson, who was there for the whole of it along with Dr. Whitfield, said afterwards was the most remarkable thing she had ever seen in a first-time mother. It was a boy. He was born on a Thursday morning after a long night, and he arrived with considerable volume and a full head of dark hair, and the first time Annie held him, she felt something so profound that she could not have found words for it and did not try. She just held him and breathed and let the profound thing be what it was. Eli came in from the porch where he had been wearing a path back and forth for 6 hours, and Dr. Whitfield met him at the bedroom door and shook his hand, and he came in and saw Annie sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, and he stopped at the foot of the bed, and his face did the thing where all the control left it entirely. She said, "Come here." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time, watched his hands, those steady, capable hands, hold this tiny human with a care so concentrated it was almost reverent. He said, barely above a whisper, "James," she said, "James Eli Boone." He looked up at her. She had not told him she was going to use his name. He said, "Annie," she said, "you have been giving me everything since the day I arrived. It seemed fair." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead and then her temple and then, very gently, the top of James's head, and she felt the completeness of it, the three of them in the January morning, the cradle waiting in the small room, the cottonwood outside bare and patient in the winter, the ranch solid and real and entirely theirs. Bess, who was still in the kitchen making coffee and behaving with great tact, could be heard humming something cheerful, and Pete, who had ridden over at dawn and was waiting outside in the cold because he felt strongly that there were certain events a man should acknowledge in person, could be heard outside the window saying something to the horses in his dry, economical way that she suspected was his version of celebration. James Eli Boone grew the way strong, healthy babies grow, steadily, and with considerable noise. By spring he was filling out and looking up at the world with the interested focus of a person who is taking notes, and Annie resumed her school mornings in April and carried him with her to the main room, and settled him in a basket near her feet while she taught, and the children treated his presence as entirely ordinary, which was exactly right. Eli adored his son with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. He would come in from the day's work and wash his hands and find the baby, wherever the baby was, and he would pick him up and talk to him in that low murmur that had worked on the cattle and now seemed equally effective on infants, and James would look at him with a fixedness that suggested profound agreement with whatever was being said. Annie watched this from the kitchen or the main room or wherever she happened to be, and she felt things she had not written in any letter and could not have written because she had not known they existed. She felt the specific and irreplaceable warmth of being in a house where love was not performed but simply practiced, daily, in ordinary moments, in the morning coffee and the evening porch, and the hand on the face in the dark, and the cradle on its runners, and the name on the deed that was now both of theirs. In the summer of 1876, the school had expanded to 11 children, and there was talk in the community about formalizing it, about applying for a proper school charter from the county. Eli brought the subject up himself one evening, having clearly been thinking about it for some time, and he laid out what he knew about the process with the organized precision of a man who had done his research. He said, "The county would provide a teacher's salary, which would be yours, and there would be some funding for materials. I spoke to Cal about it, and he thinks there's enough support in the community to make the application successful." Annie looked at him across the kitchen table. James was asleep in his cradle in the next room. The evening was warm and the window was open, and somewhere outside a mockingbird was doing its comprehensive repertoire. She said, "You spoke to Cal." He said, "And to Pastor Reeves, who is very enthusiastic, and to the Hartwells and the Garcias and the Morrisons. I wanted to know if it was feasible before I raised it." She said, "You have been organizing this." He said, "I've been looking into it. It matters to you, and therefore it matters." She reached across the table and took his hand. She said, "Eli Boone." He said, "Yes." She said, "2 years ago I wrote a letter to a man I had never met, and I told him I expected nothing. I told him that because it was true and because I thought truth was the best thing to start with." He said, "It was," she said, "but I have been thinking about that line ever since. I expected nothing. And I keep coming back to how wrong I was." He said, "You weren't wrong, you didn't know." She said, "No, but here is what I have come to think. I expected nothing because I had learned to keep my expectations small. Keeping expectations small protects you from disappointment. But it also means you build a very small life and you call it realism, and you tell yourself that is enough." She pressed his hand. "You made a very large life impossible to refuse. You just kept giving me pieces of it until the small one I had planned was entirely replaced." He was quiet for a moment. The mockingbird continued outside. He said, "I'm glad you didn't refuse it." She said, "I would have been a great fool if I had." He brought her hand up and held it against his jaw, the way he did sometimes, as if he needed to feel her nearness through more than one point of contact, and she leaned across the table and kissed him, and James slept in his cradle, and the mockingbird sang, and the Texas summer settled warm and full around the house. The school charter application was submitted in September of 1876 and was approved in November. The county sent a letter of approval and a small funding allocation, and Annie Boone was formally designated as the teacher of record for the Harlan Creek Rural District, which covered a 20-mile radius and which currently enrolled 14 children. She stood in the kitchen with the letter in her hands and felt the satisfaction of it, the deep, specific satisfaction of something that had been built carefully over time and had now been officially recognized as real. Eli was in the barn when she went to tell him. He read the letter she handed him, and when he looked up, his face was the face she had come to know as his gladness for her face, which was different from his general gladness and which she cherished specifically. He said, "This is yours. You did this." She said, "You started it." He said, "I built a table. You built a school." She laughed. He pulled her close and held her, and she breathed against his shoulder and felt the ranch around them, the good familiar sounds of it, the horses and the cattle and the creek and the cottonwood, and everything that had grown in this place since a woman with small expectations and a man with a large heart had met on a sidewalk in October 1874. By the spring of 1878, the world of the Boone Ranch had expanded further. Annie was expecting their second child, due in August, and the school had grown to 19 students and required a larger space than the main room could provide. Eli, Cal Dawson, and 4 other neighboring ranchers had spent the previous winter talking about building a proper schoolhouse on the Boone property, which was centrally located for most of the families in the district, and by March the framing was going up. James, who was 2 and entirely mobile and entirely opinionated, regarded the construction with proprietary interest. He would stand at the fence line, watching the men work with his father's serious expression and his mother's brown eyes, and the men found him greatly entertaining, particularly Pete, who had become James's devoted admirer, and who could often be found engaged in long, detailed conversations with the child about matters of mutual interest such as horses and clouds, and the respective merits of various biscuits. Annie was teaching through the spring and into the early summer with the comfortable efficiency of a woman who has found her work and her purpose in alignment, and she was larger with the second child than she had been with James, which made Dr. Whitfield look thoughtful during her April appointment in a way she noted and filed away. In June, Dr. Whitfield confirmed what he had begun to suspect. He told them, with a professional calm and a visible enjoyment of the news, that there appeared to be two babies, twins. Annie sat in the doctor's office with this information and applied to it the same organized composure she applied to everything. She said, "Are you certain?" Dr. Whitfield said, "As certain as I can be at this stage. We will know better as the time approaches." She looked at Eli, who was sitting beside her and whose composure was slightly less organized than hers at this particular moment. "He said, 2. She said, "Yes." "He said, 'We have one cradle,'" she said. "You can build another." He looked at her, and then he did something she had not seen him do since the first day she had arrived, which was look thoroughly without resource for a moment, entirely at a loss. And then he came back to himself and he looked at her properly and said, "All right, 2. She put her hand over his on the armrest between them and said, "All right, 2. He built the second cradle in July. He set it beside the first in the small room, which he had already begun expanding in April when Annie's size had made the mathematics of twins an obvious possibility. And the two cradles sat side by side on their runners, and she stood in the doorway of the room and looked at them and felt the enormity of her life, the unasked for, unexpected, entirely impossible to have predicted enormity of it. The twins came in August, as promised by the calendar if not by the general orderliness of childbirth, and they arrived within 20 minutes of each other, a boy first and then a girl, and the boy was named Thomas and the girl was Clara, which was the name they had held in reserve since that first conversation in the wagon about James and Clara, and both of them were healthy and demanding, and consumed the first several weeks entirely. Eli was magnificent. There was no other word for it. He adapted with the same practical thoroughness he brought to any difficult situation on the ranch, sleeping in 2-hour intervals, learning quickly which twin needed what and when, working the ranch during the days with Pete and Clem, and coming home in the evenings to take whoever needed holding so that Annie could eat or sleep or simply sit without a child attached to her for 20 minutes. He did all of this without performance, without requiring acknowledgement, with the straightforward intentionality of a man who understood that this was simply what the moment required. One night when Thomas and Clara were 3 weeks old, Annie was sitting up feeding Clara in the lamplight of the small room, James asleep in his own bed across the hall, Eli asleep in the main bedroom because she had sent him there firmly 2 hours ago, and Thomas was quiet for once in his cradle, and she sat in the soft lamplight and looked at her daughter's face and thought about the letter again. She expected nothing. She had written those words 2 years ago in a boarding house in Abilene, with the careful stoicism of a woman who had learned to protect herself from wanting. She had meant them with full sincerity. She had not been performing modesty or fishing for reassurance. She had genuinely believed that fairness was the ceiling of what was available, and that settling for the ceiling was a form of wisdom. And Eli Boone had taken that ceiling and turned it into a floor. She thought about all of it, about the books on the shelf and the journal with her initials, and the writing table he had built for the school and the land dispute papers laid out in order, and the table set from his end of the long ride home before she was awake, and the cradles, the two cradles sitting side by side on their runners, and the room he had built onto the house, and the school he had organized from quiet research into community support. And the look on his face on the January morning when James had been placed in his arms, and the look on his face in the doctor's office in June when the word twins had entered their lives. He had given her everything, not in the showy, proclamatory way of men who promise the sky and deliver arguments, but in the daily, steady, cumulative way of a man who paid attention and acted on what he saw. He had read her. He had understood her. He had found what she needed, and he had provided it over and over without keeping a ledger of it, without expecting return beyond her presence and her honesty and her love, which she gave him all of every day as fully as she was able. She put Clara in her cradle when the baby was done nursing, and she stood up and went to the doorway of the main bedroom and looked at him. He was asleep on his back with one arm across his eyes in the way he always slept, and the lamplight from the small room reached just far enough to show her his face, the lines of it, the jaw, the mouth that was easier in sleep than in waking, the dark hair against the pillow. She thought, I would write a very different letter now. I would write, I expect everything. I expect to be known and seen and provided for not just in material ways, but in the ways that matter most, in the being noticed, in the being understood. I expect love that is not poetry but practice. I expect a man who builds cradles. She went back to the small room and sat down and listened to Thomas breathe and Clara breathe and the cottonwood outside the window, and she was entirely, completely, wholly happy in a way that did not need anything added to it. The schoolhouse was completed and dedicated in October of 1878, and the whole district came. It was a proper building, 12 feet by 20, with real windows and a board floor, and a blackboard that had been ordered from a supply house in Dallas at considerable communal expense. And it stood 40 yards from the Boone house under 2 live oak trees that would provide shade in the summer. Annie stood at the door of it and looked inside and felt the solidity of it, the real, lasting solidity of something that would persist and grow beyond her own work in it, that would teach children who were not yet born and would stand when she was gone. Eli stood beside her. He said, "How does it feel?" she said, "like something that will last." He said, "It will," she said. "I want to say something." He said, "Then say it." She turned and looked at him fully. People were moving around them, talking, children running between the live oaks, Cal Dawson laughing at something Pete had said, Bess Dawson organizing the potluck dishes that had come from every family in the district, James running with the older children with the absolute velocity of a 2-year-old who has recently mastered his legs and cannot stop testing the discovery. Thomas and Clara were in Dora Hartwell's capable arms, both of them regarding the world with the slightly bewildered alertness of babies who have only been in it 2 months. She looked at Eli and said, "I came here expecting nothing. Do you remember? I wrote it." He said, "I remember." She said, "I was wrong. I should have expected everything, everything I have here. Everything you have given me, not the things you've built, though those matter, but the fact of being known, of being seen, of having someone who learns what you need and then quietly provides it. That should be expected. That should be the standard. I just didn't know it yet." He looked at her for a long time. The celebration moved around them and they were still in the middle of it. He said, "You gave me the same." She said, "I tried." He said, "Annie, you walked into this house with your accounts and your steady eyes and your honest letter, and you gave me somewhere to come back to for the first time in 7 years. You gave me a reason to be in the house instead of always in the barn or the pasture. You gave me James and Thomas and Clara. You gave me someone to read aloud to." His voice had the quality of a man choosing words for something that matters. "Do you know what I think about most when I think about us?" she said. "Tell me." He said, "I think about those 4 sentences I wrote in that letter. The house is ready. My name is Eli and you are welcome here." I wrote those sentences because they were the truest things I could think to say and I had no room for more. But I also wrote them because I wanted you to know that whatever came, you would be received. You would be welcomed. You would not be entering something closed. He paused. "I had no idea you were going to open it so completely." She felt the warmth of it from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. She stepped forward and put her hands on his chest, and he put his arms around her and held her in the October afternoon outside the schoolhouse in front of the entire district, which watched this display with considerable and warm approval. Bess Dawson said something to Cal that made him nod with great satisfaction. Pete said nothing, but he smiled in his dry, brief way. James, observing his parents from a small distance, said, "Papa," in the tone of a child reminding a person that their attention is being improperly allocated, and Eli released Annie with a laugh and went to collect his son, and she watched him swing James up onto his shoulders and turn back to her with James's small hands gripping his hair and his face entirely open and happy, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing that has no name yet. This is what comes after nothing." The years settled into the long, good pattern of a life that is working. James grew into a serious, curious boy with his mother's aptitude for learning and his father's patience, and he could be found most evenings in the main room with a book, occasionally conducting lengthy strategic experiments with small rocks and sticks that represented cattle operations of various complexities. Thomas and Clara grew together the way twins do, with a particular communication between them that was its own kind of language, and Clara had her grandfather's name on her birth record and her mother's stubbornness in her character, and Thomas had his father's even temperament and an interest in horses that manifested early and completely, and did not waver. In the spring of 1880, Annie was 30 years old, and the schoolhouse had 23 students, and the ranch had expanded to 420 acres, through a land purchase from an elderly rancher named Dupree who had no heirs and who had known Eli's father, and who wanted to see the land go to someone who would work it honestly. Eli added 2 more ranch hands, making 4 in total, and the operation was running well and producing well, and the accounts that Annie kept were solid and growing. She sat at the kitchen table on a March evening, the 3 children in bed, Eli across from her with his journal and a cup of coffee, and she was writing in her own journal, which was now the 3rd one, the first 2 having been filled front to back with the detailed, precise, occasionally lyrical record of the life she had found here. She wrote, "6 years ago I wrote that I expected nothing. I wrote it as a statement of protection and a statement of truth. Tonight I look up from this page, and I see the lamp and the coffee cups and my husband reading in his chair, and I can hear the children through the walls, breathing and dreaming. And outside the cottonwood tree is older and taller, and the creek is running with the spring melt, and the schoolhouse is full of children who are learning to read and count and think, and the land is ours, and the life is ours, and none of it was in my letter. I expected nothing, and I have been given everything, and I have come to understand that what I should have expected, what every person should expect, is exactly this: to be known, and to be met, and to be given the chance to grow past the limits of what you could imagine for yourself." She put down her pen and looked at Eli. He had not heard her writing. He was deep in his journal, one hand in his hair the way he always was when he was concentrating, and the lamplight was on his face, and he was 34 years old, and she had loved him for 5.5 years with the kind of love that accumulates rather than diminishes, that knows itself better the longer it goes on. She said, "Eli." He looked up. She said, "I have been thinking about something." He set down his pen. He gave her his full attention the way he always had from the very first evening over beans and cornbread. She said, "I think we should plant more along the south fence, something that will be there in 30 years. He said, "Trees," she said, "cottonwoods, like the one by the well." He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, slow and warm, the smile that still, after all this time, made her want to make him do it again. He said, "I'll get the saplings in town on Friday." She said, "Good." He picked up his pen again. She picked up hers. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the cottonwood moved in the night wind, and the children breathed in their rooms, and the creek ran in the dark, and the ranch held them all the way it had always held them, solidly, entirely, without reservation. In the summer of 1881, Annie was expecting their 4th child, a surprise that made Dr. Whitfield chuckle and made Bess Dawson say she had called it in April, and the baby came in October, a girl, the only girl among 3 brothers, which was an arrangement the brothers received with varying degrees of adjustment. James, who was 5, was gravely interested. Thomas, who was 3, wanted primarily to know if she would eventually be able to throw a ball. Clara, also 3, watched the proceedings with the proprietary air of someone whose territory has been complicated. They named her Ruth, which was Annie's mother's name, and she arrived with her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes, and a temperament that declared itself in the first hour as one that would not be easily discouraged, which made Annie laugh in the specific way you laugh when you recognize yourself. Eli held her and looked at Annie over the baby's head and said, 4. Annie said, 4. He said, "The house is full," she said. "The house has been full for a while, it just keeps getting fuller." He said, "Is that a complaint?" She said, "Not even slightly." He sat on the edge of the bed with Ruth in his arms and James peering in from the doorway and Thomas and Clara in the care of Bess Dawson in the kitchen, where she was feeding them both with the efficient authority of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this opportunity. And Annie watched her husband hold their newest daughter, and felt everything she had accumulated in 7 years on this ranch. All the warmth and the solidness and the dailiness of a love that was not a story but a life. She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up. She said, "I have told you that I came here expecting nothing. I have told you that several times." He said, "You have." She said, "What I have not told you is that the moment I stopped expecting nothing, the moment I let myself expect everything, was in the barn in December 1874 when you brought me coffee without being asked and you stayed and talked for an hour and I walked back to the house in the cold and I thought, I am in very serious trouble, because I am starting to want this, all of this, and I am terrified." He said, "Were you?" She said, "I was." It is a frightening thing to start wanting something you have trained yourself not to want. He said, "What changed the terror?" She said, You just kept being exactly what you were. You didn't change, you didn't become less." And eventually the wanting stopped being frightening and started being the thing I was building toward. He was quiet for a moment. Ruth made a small sound of contentment and settled further into the crook of his arm. He said, "I wrote my advertisement with every intention of being practical. I was lonely and the ranch needed a partner, and I was practical enough to be honest about both things. And then your letter came, and I read it, and I thought, this woman has been careful with herself. She has protected herself very well. And I thought, I want to give her a reason not to need the protection. I want to be someone she does not need to protect herself from." Annie said very quietly, "You have been exactly that." He said, "Every single day." She said, "Every single day." The room was quiet except for the baby and the night outside and the house settling around them all. The solid adobe and timber house that was not fancy but was entirely full. The house with the books on the shelf and the school 40 yards away, and the cottonwood by the well and the creek running in the dark, and the saplings along the south fence that were 3 years old now and growing toward the sky. Growing toward the 30 years she had asked for when she had looked at her husband across the kitchen table on a March evening and thought of futures. That was the shape of it. That was the whole of it. A woman who expected nothing, a man who intended everything he said, and the life they had built in the space between those two honest things. The cottonwood tree by the well grew tall over the years, taller than the house, and its branches spread wide enough that in the summer the children played in the shade of it, and in the autumn the leaves went gold and the sound of them in the wind was still the most peaceful sound Annie had ever heard. She sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to it the way you listen to something you have loved for a long time, with the particular attention you give to things you know are irreplaceable. Eli sat beside her on those evenings, as he had on every evening for all the years of their marriage, and they watched the light go out of the day the way they always had, talking sometimes, quiet sometimes, and the children's voices moved in and out of the house behind them, and the ranch was all around them, and it was still real, and it was still theirs, and it was everything. James grew into a young man who went east for 2 years to study at a proper school, and came back to the ranch, with his father's work ethic and his mother's head for accounts, and the particular combination of the two, that made him precisely the person who could carry the ranch forward when the time came. Thomas married at 22, a girl from a ranch 3 counties over named Hannah who was straightforward and good-humored, and who took to Eli and Annie immediately, and was taken to by them in kind. Clara became a schoolteacher like her mother, teaching in the Harlan Creek school that Annie eventually handed over when she turned 50, and decided that she had earned the right to only run the accounts and advise from the porch. Ruth, the youngest, the one who had arrived with the determined temperament and the refusal to be discouraged, grew up to be exactly everything her first hour had promised, capable and warm and relentlessly herself. And she moved to San Antonio eventually, and became the first woman in the county to own and operate a properly chartered pharmacy, which made her parents so proud that the letter congratulating her was 3 times longer than anything either of them normally wrote. Annie Boone, who had once written with careful protection that she expected nothing, became a woman so thoroughly and completely at home in her life that she could not remember the specific texture of the loneliness that had preceded it, only that it had existed, only that it had been the thing she was managing before the wagon had rolled out of Harlan Creek one October afternoon in 1874, and the cottonwood tree had come into view. She wrote in her last journal, on a December evening when the fire was high, and the house was warm and Eli was across from her with his own journal, as he had been for 30 years of evenings, silver in his hair now, and the lines of his face deeper, but the eyes unchanged, still the brown of creek water after rain, still finding hers when he looked up. I expected nothing, and I received everything, and the everything was not a gift given once but a practice sustained daily, and that is the truth of what love is in the particular language of practical and honest people. It is not the promise, it is the showing up. It is the cradle on its runners and the writing table against the wall and the 4 sentences at the end of which the word is welcome. It is this. It has always been this. She looked up and he was watching her, as he often was when she was writing, with the unguarded warmth of a man who had loved one woman for 30 years and found the act of loving her consistently more interesting than anything else available to him. She said, "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The day you arrived. The look on your face on the sidewalk, like you had decided to be equal to whatever happened next." She said, "I had." He said, "You were equal to everything." She said, "So were you." He smiled. She smiled back. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the cottonwood moved in the December wind, the one that had been there since before either of them, the one that would be there after, holding its ground in the Texas earth, growing toward the sky, reaching with the particular patience of something that is exactly where it belongs. And the house held them, as it had always held them, and the creek ran in the dark, and the stars over Harlan Creek were brilliant and indifferent and beautiful, the same stars they had looked at every night for 30 years from this porch, this patch of ground, this life they had built together out of honest words and patient work and the love that grows, slowly and permanently, between 2 people who choose each other every single day. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.